So, without further ado, I'm pleased to welcome Hayo Reinders, who will be talking to us today about best practices in engaging language learners. Hayo Reinders is a TESOL professor and director of research at Anaheim University in the United States. And no need to take any more of your time. Hayo, over to you.
Thank you so much, Alan. And thank you, everybody, for joining us today. I'm so pleased to be able to speak with you today about a topic that I am really passionate about, actually, because it's something that so many of us have been struggling with over the last 18 months. How do we engage language learners, especially in the physical classroom, the online classroom, the blended classroom, the mixed classrooms, and especially, of course, as many of us are starting to move back to the physical classroom, with perhaps some students remaining online virtually for a while. How do you manage all that, and how can we excite and engage our learners? So today, actually, I'm speaking to you from my adopted home country, New Zealand. I was born in the Netherlands, but I live here in beautiful Aotearoa, New Zealand. And it's a delight to be able to speak with you. The question I'm going to be trying to answer, and of course, there's a million answers to this question, but at least from my own observations and the research and teachers' experiences over the last 18 months is, well, a very short one, a very simple one, but not a very easy one. And that is, what's next? Where are we heading to from here? And so let us begin. I think before we even set out on this short journey, it's important to remind ourselves, when we say, where are we heading, what's happening, maybe what's changing, that we make a distinction between what is change on the one hand, and how does that differ from innovation on the other hand. Because, hey, we've all seen a tremendous amount of change, but maybe not quite as much innovation as we would have liked to. So let's just take a very brief look at a widely accepted definition of innovation in our field. Delano, Riley, and Crooks basically describe it as a change that is first and foremost informed. It's something that teachers and administrators and maybe communities actually have thought about. We make a conscious decision to change some of the ways that we teach or the ways that we support learning. And that's a really key point, because of course, so many of us have been forced into change without having the time, or often, unfortunately, the support to be able to make an informed change. But now that we've got 18 months of experiences behind us, I think it's time to kind of take stock, look back, look forward, and see what lessons we can draw. And that leads me to the second part of the definition here, which is that an innovation is not just any change. Oh no, it's a deep change. It's a change in what these authors call the underlying philosophy of language learning and teaching. There's some kind of way in which we think of how language learning and teaching happen in a fundamentally different way. In other words, we bring new insights about learning and teaching to the classroom. And so if we look back over, well, not just the last 18 months, but the last 118 years, if not more, what we've seen is that the majority of the education that our learners have received involves them engaging in what in the literature is described as formal learning. And of course, formal learning is what we're all very familiar with. And let me be very clear, there is absolutely nothing wrong with formal learning. And in fact, formal learning has a number of very important advantages. Formal learning is relatively easy to plan, to organize. You know exactly which learners are going to be in what classroom, on what day, and at what time. And so it has a number of very important benefits. But it is only one of very many different types of learning that our learners have access to. And what I'll do next is just briefly take you through some of these very common types of learning that are not formal learning. Now, before I continue here, I just want to mention that on the last slide of this presentation, I will give you a link to a digital handout. And that handout has everything I'm talking about here today in it, as well as additional references to articles that I've written, that other people have written. So if there's any point of this presentation you'd like to learn more about, you can do so with the handout on the last slide. It also includes a link to a PDF version of the PowerPoint. So just to let you know that will be coming up later. So what exactly are learning spaces? I've put the label here at the top. What are they? Well, learning spaces are essentially all the different environments that are available to our learners to learn in and from. Clearly, the school, the classroom is a very important learning space. And what we've seen over the last 18 months is one very important change, and I'm using this word very deliberately, from teaching and learning in a physical space, the classroom, to what mostly is referred to as remote learning. Some type of, often some sort of blend, but at least a type of learning that includes an online virtual component. But the question we have to ask ourselves is whether that transition is only a change from physical to virtual, or whether also there have been actual deeper level innovations, shall we say, in the types of language learning and teaching that has entailed. And it is my contention and my observation that in many cases it hasn't. So let's look to see, if we're talking about learning spaces that are available to our learners, what other types of environments we could possibly draw on as teachers in order to support our learners. And so I'm not going to go through all of them on this diagram here. Again, that'll be on the handout if you want to look up some further reading later, but I'll give you a couple of examples. I think one that most of us will be familiar with is the notion of flexible learning. And so in flexible learning, the timing of the instruction is not predetermined. So learners decide when they need help with a particular issue and then go and get that support. And an example of that in a language teaching environment, a very common one, is the use of, say, a self-access center or an independent learning center where a drop-in facility of some sort exists where learners can go when they feel that they need to read more or talk to someone or catch up on something that they didn't quite understand in class. In the adult learning space in corporate environments, a lot of staff development is available along flexible terms as well. It's not necessarily that everyone needs to be at a workshop on Monday morning at 9 o'clock, but staff members can choose what they want to learn and when. Another example that may be less familiar with many of you is described as performance support. And this is a really interesting one because I think, based on the literature and from what I can observe, that actually performance support is quite possibly the most common way that at least adults learn anything, not just language, but basically anything. And so performance support involves, you can see from the picture, you see someone digging up a hole in the road, and there's somebody standing next to them with a laptop, maybe giving some advice. Well, what this describes, what this visualizes, is that someone is carrying out, is performing some type of task, in this case, a professional task, and needs some additional help to complete that task, to perform that task, and goes to someone else to get that help. Now, if you think about it, in your own work as a teacher, if you have a problem, you don't necessarily go immediately and enroll in some kind of formal, course or educational program. You just go and talk to a colleague, and maybe you look over their shoulder to see how they're doing, or maybe you observe their classes, or you go to YouTube and watch a video, or you join a conference. And so performance support is a really powerful and very, very common type of learning that exists for our learners. Another one, which I'm actually very excited about myself, and I'll give you a practical example in a couple of minutes, is game-based learning. Because, well, think about this. As children, when we grew up, we learned first and foremost through play, through games. And as we get older, we kind of lose touch with that playful aspect of our lives. And that's a real loss, because games can be incredibly powerful in not just motivating us to participate and to try new things, but also sustain us and help us in learning new skills. And we see that, for example, very clearly in the area of digital gaming, which of course is now used in so many aspects of life for educational purposes, whether it be from training pilots how to fly a new aircraft, to training surgeons on how to perform an operation. So again, I'll give you an example of that in just a moment. So there is a huge range of spaces. The ones that I haven't even talked about are informal learning, things like listening to music, watching movies, using the subtitles, talking to friends, peer learning, learning together with a buddy, mentor-based learning, or coach-based learning. The list is just endless. And well, in language teaching, we tend to limit ourselves to just one of these, which is the formal classroom environment. Now, here's an interesting statistic that I've shared with Cambridge Talks before, but it's worth repeating. We don't know exactly what the number is, but a good estimate is that somewhere between 70 and 80% of all adult learning takes place outside of formal education. Just think about that for a moment. The vast majority of adult learning has nothing to do with what we think of as the classroom, right? But even learners who are in compulsory education, if you're teaching primary or secondary school students, for example, still spend about 87.5% of their hours every day being outside of formal education, being in the family, being in the home, playing sports, being with friends, being in social communities, being online, maybe playing games, right? So even during the secondary, primary, compulsory part of learners' lives, most of our time is spent, outside of formal education. Now, not only is this important because it is so common, but also because all of these different types of learning spaces support a huge range of different forms of learning, each of which has been described and investigated and researched over a period of at least 100 years. And for those of you interested in following up on some of these references here, I've included these as examples of such types of learning as ubiquitous learning, meaning learning that can take place anywhere. And there's a huge amount of research that demonstrate the effectiveness of that, being able to access learning opportunities, not just at a particular moment in time or in a particular place, but across your whole life. Another one, of course, autonomous learning or personal learning, an area that I've been very interested in myself. And one of the books up here is co-edited by myself and Terry Lamb on that subject. Social learning and situated learning and experiential learning, where learners learn through having experiences, not just listening to someone giving them knowledge, but actually going out into their everyday lives and engaging in experiences, in language learning experiences. And well, we know that all these types of learning are incredibly powerful. And so the question is, how do we draw on that? So I think most of us will have been very familiar for a long time with the notion of lifelong learning. And well, I think all of us also will agree that learners who are currently in our classes are one day not going to be in our classes anymore, and we need to prepare them for that. Whether it's learners who have to move from, say, a secondary environment to a tertiary environment, or whether it's learners who move from a university to a professional context, or learners who move professions or jobs at some point in their careers. We try as teachers to prepare learners for dealing with the challenges that entails. So lifelong learning has been on our radar for a long time. But it is my argument that equally important is the notion of life-wide learning. In other words, asking yourself, what are all the different environments, all the different learning spaces, as they are called, that are available to my learners? And how can I prepare my learners to make the most of these life-wide experiences? And when they're engaged in those experiences, how can I support them so that they can make the most of them? And so in the next part, what I want to do is share with you some practical experiences, some ideas, suggestions that I've come up with over the years myself, some of which may be relevant in your own context as well. The first, as I mentioned earlier, is the notion of digital gaming, or any type of gaming, really. And so the project that I want to briefly share with you actually took place in Thailand. And at the university where we were doing our research, this is Sorada Watana from Thailand, who was a former PhD student of mine, was an engineering context, a university where in an engineering program, a lot of learners were frankly not very motivated to learn English. I mean, these were people training to be engineers, and they had to take compulsory English classes. Another problem that we had, apart from low motivation, was the fact that, especially in Thailand, also in other countries, of course, but in Thailand, a lot of learners experience a really great amount of anxiety around speaking and using the language in a public space. There is a huge lack of confidence and a very high level of language anxiety, which really prohibits these students from just trying and developing themselves in that way. And so the idea we came up with was actually very, very simple. We asked these students, well, what do you do in your spare time? And especially these people being engineers, a lot of them said, well, we love playing computer games. That's the space that we spend a lot of our time in. And so we found out that at that time, this is a few years ago, that an online role-playing game called Ragnarok was very, very popular with many of the students. And so we decided to experiment with bringing that into the classroom in some way. Okay. Now, we still had to meet the curricular outcomes and requirements, right? So we couldn't just do whatever we wanted. There was a test, there was a curriculum, and we had to make sure that these engineering students developed all the kinds of skills that the curriculum called for, such as the ability to have conversations and the ability to interact in the target language, in this case, English. So here's what we did. We said to them, you know what, next time when you're in class, you are allowed to play this game as much as you want. And they looked at us at first and said, are you serious? Are you telling us that we can play computer games in our compulsory English class? And we said, yes, you can. But there are two simple rules that you have to follow. The first of them is that you have to use the international server when playing this game. It's an online game, so obviously there's servers in different countries. If you play the online one, the language, the lingua franca is English. So right off the bat, everybody had to suddenly type their messages into the chat windows and do their speaking in English. The second thing we told them was, we're going to give you a number of quests. And you can think of quests, if you're not a game player, as types of adventures that you go on within a game. From a language teaching perspective, there are essentially combinations of different language learning tasks. And so the kinds of things, you don't need to read this in detail, but the kinds of things that we had our learners do was included, going out and talking to people to find out where the treasure might be hidden, and exchange information with other teams to defeat the evil wizard or whatever it may be within the game. The point was, we made it clear to them that they had to collaborate, they had to communicate, they had to negotiate, and they had to figure out the problem together. Well, you can imagine that that meant that they had to spend a lot of time communicating with each other and other players online. So what was the impact of that? Well, we did a study on this, and well, here's an interesting point. We investigated a concept called willingness to communicate, which may be familiar to some of you, but for those of you who are new to it, is essentially a concept that describes the extent to which a learner is psychologically and cognitively ready to engage in target language, English language production in a given moment in time, right? So willingness to communicate is a really interesting and useful construct to investigate. So as you can imagine, we investigated our learners, their willingness to communicate before and after they played this computer game. And well, it was very, very, very clear. Not only were they far more willing to communicate using the online role-playing game, their level of language learning anxiety went down statistically significantly and very considerably so. Their level of confidence and their ability to take some risk in the language went up commensurately, also at a very significant level. Why? Well, I think the answer is pretty clear, because we allowed our learners to bring into the classroom an environment, a space, a learning space that they care about, that they enjoy, that they spend a lot of time in, where part of their, shall we say, their identity resides. Now, we didn't have to create games ourselves or do anything technically complicated. All we had to do was just tell them, hey, it's okay. You can bring what you enjoy. You can bring your hobbies, your passions, your leisure into the classroom, and we'll make it work so that you can actually learn some language from that. Here's a second way of engaging your learners that has proven to be very successful, not just in the last 18 months, but I would say over the last 10, 15 years. Because the idea of backchanneling has been around for quite a long time. So what is a backchannel? A backchannel is essentially a way to give learners a voice, an opportunity to communicate what they want, what they need, not just by the traditional in-class, put up your hand and ask the teacher to explain something again, which risks making you look silly, but instead giving learners, maybe using technology, a range of different ways in which they can communicate what they need and want, perhaps anonymously or perhaps by asking other learners, but at the very least, not so publicly as in a traditional classroom. And so the kinds of tools I've listed here at the bottom, these are not ones that I particularly endorse or that I think are the best. It's just, these are examples of the kinds of tools that allow teachers to give students different ways of communicating what they want and need. And today's session is a good example of that. I mean, we've got a chat window, you can exchange comments. I don't need to respond to every comment. I mean, in this case, I couldn't even have wanted to, but you can, refer each other to additional resources. You can ask questions of other participants. You've got the Q&A box, which is also an interesting way of opening up a channel of communication. And that's just a simple chat or Q&A box. So experimenting with some of these apps is potentially very, very powerful. And the reason behind that, well, it's basically the same as the idea of digital gaming, is that it tells your learners, hey, I want to hear from you. I want to hear from you on your terms. I'm not going to put you on the spot and ask you to put up your hand in a full classroom with 30 other students and make you look stupid if that's how you feel. Instead, I'm going to give you ways to communicate to me that you want me to go faster or slower, or explain something again, or that you like the class, or that you don't like the class, or that you have a question. So the communication is no longer just from teacher to learner, which is a vertical communication channel, but it's also horizontal. It's from one learner to another learner, right? And it's a lot more open, and it's a lot more shared in that sense. In a similar sort of vein, a really interesting tool that I've used in many cases over the years, and that has been one of my favorite activities, is digital storytelling, right? And this is something that I think some teachers have started experimenting with during the pandemic, but that I hope that we will continue to incorporate in our physical face-to-face classrooms, because wow, digital storytelling is powerful. I mean, especially if you have learners who, for whatever reason, are not quite proficient enough or are not confident enough to express themselves in English or whatever language they're learning, fluently. With digital storytelling, you're giving them the tools to express themselves, not just using words, but also using images, using video, using anime, using cartoons, using whatever it may be. And again, especially for lower level proficiency students, it's liberating to be able to say what you want to say and share what you want to share in this type of environment. But perhaps even more important than that is the idea that learners really appreciate, not just appreciate, that's the wrong word. They really thrive on being able to share their voice, being able to, to be present in the learning space, perhaps in your classroom, as who they are, as a person, not just as a learner, as some anonymous, learner number 27 or whatever, but with their own preferences, their own ideas, their own likes and dislikes, their own interests, their own dreams. And telling stories is so powerful. If you can tell your story, and if somebody's willing to listen, that validates you as a person, right? That tells you, I'm willing to listen to you and to learn about you. Well, how powerful is that? We don't just like it. All of us need it. We thrive on it. And so giving your learners an opportunity to tell their story is an incredibly powerful way of engaging them within your learning space. And so whether you use digital storytelling or non-digital traditional storytelling, in a way, it doesn't matter so much. But the point is, how are you going to give your learners a voice? And of course, there are many apps that allow you to do that, right? And again, the example here is Class Dojo, but there are hundreds of these apps, Kahoot and Socrative and Seesaw and, so many others. And I'm not suggesting that any one of them is better than the other. But what they have in common is that they allow you as a teacher to recognize your learners individually, and not just in terms of their language learning outcomes. You're not just kind of marking their tests, but you are recognizing that, hey, you green guy in the front here on the first bench, you were very kind to your neighbor. You were actually working together as a team. You did really well to support your classmates. And that's what we want to encourage in this school, in this class. And so I'm going to recognize that, and I'm going to give you a point for that, or a sticker, depending on how old your learners are, right? So a lot of it comes down to us as teachers. Are we able to recognize what our learners want, who they are, what they like, what they do outside of our relatively small classroom environment? So the next few minutes, I actually want to change tack a little bit, and I want to kind of deal with a topic that I think is receiving a lot of attention at the moment, will receive a tremendous amount of more attention in the next 2 or 3 or 4 years. And that is the idea of augmented and virtual reality. Now, I know that all of us probably at least have heard of these terms. And I also think that many of us will think, well, that's not really relevant to my classroom. Maybe you're teaching in a small school and you certainly can't afford the technology to buy, I don't know, virtual reality handsets or what have you. But here's the thing. There's been in the last, I would say, 6 to 12 months, a lot of talk about something called the Metaverse, not the universe, the Metaverse. And a lot of companies, including Facebook, are spending very significant amounts of their parts of their budget on this new kind of online environment, so-called the Metaverse. And in fact, Facebook just announced this week or last week that it was going to hire up to 10,000 engineers in Europe to help build the Metaverse. And so I think if a company of that size decides to spend that amount of time and effort on building this, it behooves us to ask, well, what impact does that have on, for example, education? So first of all, what's the Metaverse? Well, the Metaverse, in the simplest way to put it, is essentially a three-dimensional version of the internet. So instead of just going to a website and seeing a 2D kind of page, you would walk around different websites and companies as a 3D avatar, and you would enter a store as a 3D person, as a 3D avatar, and you would buy things there, and you would play games, and you would communicate with people as a person moving around. Now, it's not my intention to talk about the Metaverse, but I do want to kind of show all of you how, well, actually most of us, maybe all of us, have the ability to incorporate these kinds of ideas into our teaching. And the reason why I decided to tackle this quite technical and maybe a little bit difficult topic in this presentation is that actually we already know how to do it. And it's very pedagogically relevant to language teaching and learning. So let me briefly take you through it for a couple of minutes. So again, you've probably all heard of augmented reality and virtual reality. So they operate on what's called a virtuality continuum. And the virtuality continuum runs from just the real world, or also known as reality, to augmented reality, to augmented virtuality, to virtual reality. So let me give you a couple of examples. Augmented reality, for those who are not familiar with the concept, is essentially overlaying, adding to the real world some kind of digital or electronic information. And most commonly, that is done using just your average cell phone. You don't need a special tool for that. So in the example here, I'm looking through my cell phone, I'm looking at a building, and I can see that it is for sale, and I can see the price, and I can see the size of the apartment, and I can see the contact details of how I can find out more about this apartment. Similarly, you might be pointing at the Eiffel Tower or the Statue of Liberty or some temple that you're familiar with and get information as you are walking around physically in the environment. And that doesn't need to be, by the way, using your cell phone. There are a lot of devices now that are becoming available, that are and have been available for years, that allow you to do something similar. I have this one in my car. I have an older car, a cheap car, and I've installed this on my dashboard. And basically the augmented reality box on my dashboard tells me things like where to go, where to turn. It shows me when I receive a message when I'm driving, and I can decide either to pull over or to ignore it. So augmented reality is not only very common now, but becoming more and more common, and has a lot of opportunity for language learning. Very soon, and when I say very soon, I do mean in the next 2 to 3 years, maybe less, we will start to see developments like these kind of not you know, like what are they called? Lenses, yeah, contact lenses that you wear not to help you improve your seeing, your ability to see, but instead that overlay through the lens information about what you're looking at. So you might be looking at, for example, a learner, and the information on your eyeball will show you you're looking at a learner whose name is Rosa, and she is 17 years old, and her prior qualifications are this and that, and she has trouble with vocabulary and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of potential there for educational purposes, but we're not quite there yet. We're getting there, but we're not quite there yet. So that's augmented reality. Virtual reality is where essentially you are basically immersing yourself into another world. And so things like the Oculus Quest and the HTC Vive and many other devices allow you to kind of wear a headset, and you're basically transported into a 3D world where you can move and walk around and engage with objects. So that's VR, or virtual reality. And of course, you can also combine these two. You can have like an augmented virtuality. So this is a virtual image that you're looking at, but hey, there's a picture, an actual picture of a real guy. And so that would be augmented virtuality. Now, you may be asking, okay, that sounds interesting, but what's the point in relation to language learning and teaching? Because I don't have the technology to do this, or I don't have the skills to develop language learning opportunities using these types of applications. Well, actually, I've got to correct you there. You do. And in fact, all of us do, because as long as you have access to a cell phone, augmented reality in particular is something that all of us can incorporate into our teaching. And I want to show you a couple of examples. And the first is from a university I work with a lot in Tokyo, Kanda University, where essentially we walked around the university, and especially around the Language Learning Center and the Self-Access Center, and we created information about all the different facilities and resources available there. So for example, as a learner, you can walk around and all you do is just hold up your cell phone and you look at different objects and different places, and it will tell you, hey, every day from 9 to 11 or whatever, you can come here and have a conversation group. Or every Wednesday from 10 to 4, you can come here and have an advising session and have a meeting with a language advisor. Really powerful stuff, because it encourages learners to just walk around and explore. Here's another example, and this one is really interesting. And again, using freely available, apps that any one of us has access to. And this one is using the library at the university. And the library contains a lot of reading resources for language learners, including graded readers, which of course, as you know, are very powerful ways of encouraging learners to read at different grades, at different levels. But here's the difference. You hold your phone up, you look at the book, and it will tell you how other people have rated that particular book. And you can add your own rating or your own comments, and you can say, well, this is a great book, but it was really quite difficult. Or I recommend this book because it has a lot of vocabulary that is helpful to prepare for, I don't know, the TOEFL or the IELTS exam, right? The final one I want to share with you, and this is a really exciting one, Ewan Bonner and Aaron Freezer, again, at Kanda University have been working on, is where as a learner, you hold up your phone and you look at a textbook that you're using in class, right? So this is a physical textbook, okay? Now, we've all had this problem, right? You've got a class of 20, 30, whatever it is, students. Some of them are here with their level and some of them are here. How do you cater to all of them? For some of them, the reading text or whatever it is that you have in your class is just too simple, it's boring. And for some of them, it's way too hard and it's just frustrating, okay? So what do? Well, using augmented reality, a learner can hold their phone up, look at the book, and if they're very good and finish the task early, they can get some additional questions or some additional reading or some comprehension questions. If I'm not very good, I too can hold up my phone, point it at the book, and get, for example, definitions or translations or whatever of difficult vocabulary. Or I can get some additional background information about the story that I'm reading. In other words, I can kind of catch up with the rest of the group because of the scaffolding. Now, the final example I want to show you is probably the most relevant one, and one that I'm very excited about. A few years ago, some colleagues and I in Thailand again did a study using augmented reality, and here's what we are facing. This is the challenge we had. We had university students from all over the university who had to take compulsory English classes, and many of them really struggled to understand why they had to do this. Why did they have to take these courses? Why did they have to learn English? I'm not really interested in the topic. And so motivation was very low. Okay, so here's what we did. We said, well, maybe you can create for future visitors to your university campus a tour, an augmented reality tour, so that if you are a conference participant or visiting lecturer or whatever, you can walk around the campus with your cell phone, you can hold it up, you can point at different buildings, and you can learn, for example, where the library is, or how you can get a card to access the building, or who you need to speak to get a new email account. Well, this was interesting because we went to the university and said, if our students develop this, and if it's good, will you put this up online and make it available as a tour for visitors to your campus to use? And they said, yeah, of course, if it's any good, absolutely, this will be a great resource. So that's what we told our students. We said, well, universities agreed. They need help getting visitors around the campus and giving them the necessary information. And the printed brochures that we've been using in the past are not very helpful. So go out, take pictures of all the different parts of the campus, and add your recordings, add your instructions, write down the opening times or whatever it may be that is relevant for a visitor to need to be able to navigate, to maneuver around the campus. Well, you can imagine what happened. These guys suddenly had a purpose. They were like, well, this is meaningful. This is not me writing an essay about, what I did on the weekend, because I've done that for the last 10 months. This is actually something that we can build and that could make our university, proud. So we're going to do our best because we want our university to look good. And so, wow, the kinds of recordings, the kinds of information, the kinds of pictures that they took, the kinds of videos that they recorded, that they came up with were absolutely spectacular. And perhaps more importantly, their motivation levels went through the roof. What did we need for that in terms of technology? Just a cell phone and a free app. At that time, we used something called Layar. There are other apps available at the moment. If you Google them, you can find them straight away. So in other words, we didn't need any special technical skills. We didn't need any kind of special equipment or hardware. All we needed was to find a way to get our learners out there using the language in the real world. And so what I want to finish with is kind of, in a way, putting it all together, because frankly speaking, we have so many technological tools available to us, each of which has its own what are called affordances or potential benefits. The only way to realize those potential benefits is for us as teachers, not IT specialists or engineers or computer scientists. No, for us as teachers to figure out how we can use these apps and these programs to get our learners to do things that matter pedagogically. And as I've been arguing throughout this presentation, well, one very important way to do that is to link what happens inside the classroom with what happens outside the classroom, and especially focus on what happens where these two come together. Because, hey, if you're interested in supporting lifelong and life-wide learning, that's where you need to be. And to do that, well, we don't just tell students, go out and, use augmented reality or go online and find some language learning resources. No, it's our jobs to show them how they can learn from these resources. So we start by encouraging them and just giving them ideas, sowing a seed, showing them like, hey, there is actually opportunities for you to read English outside the classroom. There's opportunities for you to watch movies outside the classroom or speak with people in an online role-playing game outside the classroom, right? So it's encouraging learners. And then moving on to supporting, right? Getting learners to practice for using the target language outside the classroom by themselves, but in a safe environment where you as a teacher are present, where you can offer advice and suggestions and feedback and give learners the confidence that they know how to go out and learn by themselves. If they want to speak to a native speaker, for example, don't just tell them, go out and do it. No. Practice in class. How do you approach a stranger? What kinds of conversation skills do you need? What kinds of opening gambits can we use in English? And only when your learners develop a level of confidence and skill do you actually get them to go out, but you still prepare them. You give them clear instructions. You tell them where to go. You tell them what to do, and you give them feedback. Once they feel confident and able to do that, you can get them to go out and engage in tasks that involve learning beyond the classroom, where they can tell you, hey, I'm actually interested in sports, or I like going to my local church or mosque, and I want to do something with that, right? But still asking learners to bring that back to the classroom and share their experiences. What worked? What didn't work? Why was it so difficult for you? What would you do differently next time? How can I support you better, right? You're really constantly trying to link what happens inside the classroom with what happens outside the classroom. So the three questions I want to leave you with, maybe to ponder at some future stage, is first of all, ask yourself, what learning spaces are available to my learners? What do they do? Who are they? What do they care about? What do they like? What learning spaces do they occupy? And how could I encourage them and prepare them and support them in their learning in these spaces? And how could I bring those experiences into the classroom so that learners feel that their interests and needs are actually part of the educational experience that they have? And to summarize it all into one simple graphic, the question is, how can you bring what is currently often a very separated experience together? How can you merge? How can you combine how learners experience their everyday lives with everything they care about, who they are, who they want to be, with their learning? How can we combine these two? And if you can find ways to do that, maybe using some of the technology we have available to us now, that is a tremendously powerful experience. As I said to you before, I've compiled for you a digital handout. Maybe somebody from CUP can type the address, the URL into the chat window. But if you want to go to my website, just go to innovationandteaching, one word, .org, and you'll find lots and lots of articles and all sorts of stuff and videos about the topics that we've been talking about today. If you want to go straight to the handout and the PowerPoint, innovationandteaching.org, again, /cup.php. Once again, that's innovationandteaching.org /cup.php, and that will take you straight to the handout, and that's where you can also download the PowerPoint presentation. And finally, I have to say, please get in touch. I'd love to hear from you, because this work is important. It is about the future of language education. It is about our learners, about their lives, about their futures. And so whatever you try out, whatever you experiment with, whether it works or not, let me know. I'd love to hear from you. Contact me in any of these ways. So thank you so much for your attention. And Alan, I'm sure you've collected some good questions for us.
We've got lots of questions, but first I have to say we have lots of positive comments in the chat box. They're still coming in. The thanks a lot, the claps as we do in Asia. Very, very impressed with the the session, thought that it was informative and practical. So a lot of people really commenting on that. So thank you, Hayo. It was interesting, but very realistic, and as people are saying, showing heart. We have some questions that came in right away in the chat box, even before in the Q&A box before the session started. And I'm going to kind of combine two together to see if you can speak about it. Rosalba asked, when it comes to engaging culturally diverse students in the EFL class, do you have any specific tips for that? Is there anything to be aware of and be respectful? And Emily also kind of asked about engaging CALD, called cultural and linguistically diverse learners, maybe learners who have disabilities or differently able, that sort of thing with it. Just in general, I think that there's a lot of questions in the box about dealing with the differences of our students, whatever they may be, and what impact that might have on how we engage them, and any tips for that.
Yes, thank you. That is such a powerful question. I'm so glad that many of you asked that, because, hey, our learners are all individuals. Sure, in some ways, organizationally, managerially, we can kind of put them into groups and say this is level X or level Y, or these learners are such and such. At the end of the day, every person is individual. And so I hope that in some ways I've tried to convey through my presentation what matters the most, at least for the individual learner, is that you recognize who they are and that you give them the time of day to express who they are and give them a voice to do so, right? Not just, like in general saying, well, I appreciate, people of different abilities, or I appreciate, people of, whatever. No, actually putting into learners' hands the tools to communicate who they are, what they want, what they like, what they don't like, and so on. And that's not always easy, because it means as a teacher that you have to open yourself up to become more flexible and perhaps change some things about your curriculum or your classes, right? But if you're willing to do that, wow, you've just opened up a fantastic gate through which so much learning can take place.
Yeah, personally speaking, when I saw your learner ecology model there, I thought, this is great to remind us that, yes, bring in the technology, but yes, remember we're dealing with humans and meeting them where they're at. So I thought that was just great. Another question, a lot of things had to do with games and the game-based learning. We had one from quite simply just asking, could you say the name of the game again that you used, because they missed it. But also Ruadi, who said, I can't imagine allowing students to play games during class. I know you mentioned those 2 rules, but isn't this risky? And how can we possibly control the class? What are you talking about, games in the class?
Oh, I love it. It's fantastic. Yeah, I know we were nervous. We were nervous ourselves. Don't get me wrong. It's not like we knew what was going to happen. We really worried that maybe all that's going to happen is that our learners are like way off, doing things on their online games that we don't even understand, because, we're not necessarily as much game players as they are. But well, hey, we've all been through a lot. And I think one of the absolutely clear conclusions we can draw from our experiences is that nobody knows where, anything, which means that everybody knows everything. And that's a very powerful statement, in the sense that it's only you and I as teachers, as learners, who can figure out together what works best for us. And so being willing to just take a little bit of a risk and just give it a go and see what happens, and figure it out, because that's how you improve. And you know what? Here's the main thing. Even if it doesn't work out, your learners will see, they will sense, they will smell that you are willing to take a risk, that you're willing to listen to them and ask them, what do you want? What do you like? Well, let me try and bring that into the classroom. Maybe it doesn't work, we'll try something else. You know what? If you do that, your learners will be like, wow, yeah, okay, my teacher actually cares about what I care about, and I appreciate that, right? By the way, the name of the game that we used was Ragnarok, R-A-G-N-A-R-O-K. That's about 5 years ago. There's, so many other games like, Civilization, what have you, and Minecraft. Doesn't matter what you use. Ask your learners, what excites you? What do you care about?
And thank you for that. Also in the chat box, I noticed there was a lot of interest in what you were saying about digital storytelling. Do you have any recommendations for digital storytelling apps that you might go to?
They're all good. I mean, Twine is one that seemed was it TWINE or TWYNE? I'm not sure. But anyway, Twine is one that is used a lot. Frankly speaking, it doesn't matter because, hey, it's digital storytelling. Essentially, what you're telling your learners is, I want to hear from you. You tell me what you want to tell me in the way that you want to tell me. If you like cartoons, all right, tell me in the form of a cartoon. If you like music, you know what? If you can write a song, tell me the form of the song. It doesn't matter. But you're telling your learners, whatever it is, however you do it, I want to hear from you. Right? And whatever technology you use to make that happen is secondary.
All right, and I think we have time for one more question, and I think that I'll sum it up with this one from Saba here, who says, just in your mind, could you provide us with some resources that you like, titles of books or blogs or websites, just to, if you wanted to go on and take this to the next level? And I'm secretly hoping you'll talk about yours, because I personally liked yours about games that has the checklist of games in there too. So I'm setting it up over to you for a plug there, Hayo, as well. But
thank you so much.
Where do we go to? No, it's a brilliant book, but where do we go after this if we want to find out more about that?
Frankly speaking, the digital handout that I've put together for you, I hope will answer some of your questions, because it includes lists and links to articles that both I and other people have written that are available publicly for free in the public domain. So I suggest that, go to that link, have a look there. Perhaps more relevantly and usefully, if you're not sure where to go next, just reach out, just send me an email. You can find my, contact details on my website, or if you use any of these apps, just don't hesitate. Just, feel free to reach out. I'm so happy to help. So that'll be great.
All right, thank you so much, Hayo. And if everybody can again help me in the chat box by showing your appreciation to him with our claps and everything. It was really, really a great session. That's all we have time for today. So again, thanks to all of you. Thanks to Hayo. Thanks for all of you who have joined today for the Academic English Conference.